Hello. I read another book recently. It's called The Complete Poetry and Prose of Chairil Anwar. Um, for those who are unfamiliar with him, Chairil Anwar is an Indonesian poet, and he wrote poetry in the 40s mostly, the late 30s and throughout the 40s, and this is also just a random coincidence, I guess, but he also kind of died quite young, just like the last poet I spoke about, Georg Trakl. Chairil Anwar is an Indonesian poet. He lived there all his life, and he ruminates a lot about death and individualism and a lot of very existentialist thought throughout his poems. There are a lot of great ones in the collection, and he unfortunately died quite young, died at 26. And this is an English translation of his poems, and a lot of his poetry is very much it's very descriptive and downright depressing to some extent. And when you read more about his life, he was a poet from this, what they call it, the 1945 generation, and essentially he was just one of these early kind of writers that were trying to push the ways in which the Indonesian collective consciousness was processing a lot of what was going on in their lives while they were being colonized by Japan in the 40s. It's very interesting, I think, to read Indonesian poetry like this one, like this collection by Chairil Anwar, particularly because I think that Indonesian culture, not just for the arts and poetry, but just Indonesian culture in general, is very much something that is almost entirely disregarded in the West. I cannot name any instance in my college education and just in general pop culture that Indonesia has really been represented in any kind of way, or Indonesian thought has been brought into the consciousness of America of sorts. Perhaps because if I were to kind of guess why, some of the reasons why this may be, perhaps it's because the country is mostly Islamic. Around 90%, I think, of the country is Muslim. Perhaps some kind of anti-Islamic sentiment may be contributing to some of this. Perhaps because I'm not very familiar with the demographics of sorts, but perhaps that they just don't really migrate much to the United States. So maybe they don't get as much representation vocally in terms of the arts and pop culture and all these kinds of sorts of things. Many kind of reasons for why it could be, but I'm telling you, this is one of my favorite, if not one of my, this is one of my favorite poetry books I've ever read in general, because there's just something about the way he writes that is so, you can tell he's someone who it's so visceral how he engages with his day-to-day living in a way that you feel like he is somewhat very enlightened about life. It's weird to say it in that way, but there are many great poems here. His most famous one, if I can find it, is called I think it's called, let me find it, Ako, which in Indonesian it means me or I, which is actually the same word in Tagalog in the Philippine language, which I'm more familiar with. But the poem Aku is his most famous work, and it really exemplifies this kind of this kind of engaging with the meaning of identity and individualism as in this kind of third world environment. let me try to read some of it. When my time comes, I want to hear no one's cries, not yours either. Away with all who cry. Here I am, a wild beast, driven out the herd. Bullets may pierce my skin, but I'll keep on. Carrying forward my wounds and my pain, attacking until suffering disappears. I want to live another 1,000 years. So it's kind of this sense in which, as much as day-to-day life may be kind of a drag of sorts and just to some extent pure suffering because of perhaps the Japanese colonization was one of the more brutal ones. It kind of carries the sense of burdened optimism for the future. I want to live 1,000 years. Aku mau hidup 1,000 tahun lagi. It's just the sense of like, as much as you push me down as a human being, as an individual, as a person, I will try my best to always push back and always fight. And that fighting spirit is something that kind of resonates in a lot of his poems, and it's very inspiring to read. And I highly recommend, if ever you find a way to get a copy of these poems. I'm not sure how accessible this is. I'm lucky to have been able to get it through my library, but I'm not sure how easily accessible this is. But perhaps you can find some translated of stuff of his online. I have found some websites that translate some of his poetry, but I highly recommend this. Chairil Anwar, Indonesian poet, great poet, and I hope that sometime in the future more of his work will probably get integrated into culture, perhaps by some usually it comes through some kind of Hollywood adaptation like of his life or something, or maybe a book that will kind of talk more about this stuff. The problem is there just really isn't many Indonesian voices, I think, that have made it into the sphere of pop culture in the United States and in the Western culture. But hopefully it will happen soon, and I'm 100% sure Anwar's poetry will be a big part of that rediscovery. So yeah, big fan.